Some key battles are fought in the shadows. Secret strikes in hostile territory or no man's land, where details can be hidden or exaggerated to suit the dark arts of propaganda and espionage. These are the intriguing stories of 4 infamous Second World War special operations that were not what they seemed. The seemingly swashbuckling snatch of Mussolini from a mountaintop, that was little more than one man's swagger. How Hitler's notorious henchman was saved by a woeful choice of weapon, then ultimately damned by his own arrogance and a minute microbe. A leap into a lair of thousands of German troops. They were deceived by a secret agent who dressed as a shepherd, and against all odds, herded their decorated commander into captivity and an unlikely lifelong friendship. And the werewolves who dropped out of the sky and emerged from a dark forest. Their nightmare war of resistance was no more than an apparition that ended with a futile murder in the dying days of the war. Our first story starts in 1938. The Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was one of few leaders who supported Hitler when he annexed Austria.
Warum bin glücklich, diesen großen und treuen Mann als meinen Freund bezeichnen zu dürfen?
Italy's fascist supremo stood by his fellow dictator, and Hitler would not forget his loyalty.
This was a decisive moment for Hitler. And Hitler said in 1936, I will never forget this. I will never forget this, that you turned aside from the victorious powers from the First World War to my side, which was really a crucial date in this relationship.
A few years later, the sun was setting on the Axis empire that had threatened to take over the world. British and American forces landed in Sicily in July 1943. The first key Allied toehold in Western Europe was blasted into the tip of the Italian boot. Hitler's ally was vulnerable. The Italian peninsula was a back door through which the Allies could smash their way into the Balkans and into the Reich itself. From Sicily, British Commonwealth and American troops advanced onto the mainland. German troops were sent to reinforce the vulnerable soft underbelly that lay below the Reich. Many were captured by an enemy that advanced further north, towards Rome. The Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, had collaborated with Mussolini. He'd signed laws that condemned thousands of Italian Jews. But when the tide of the war turned, the king switched sides. He appointed a former general and colonial governor, Pietro Badoglio, as prime minister. Those who once marched with Mussolini turned against him. Dismissed and under arrest, Il Duce disappeared in captivity. Hitler kept his promise. He would not abandon his fascist ally. The Führer wanted a Panzer Grenadier regiment to storm Rome and arrest the entire Italian government. His generals persuaded him to wait until more troops could be sent as a backup. But Hitler was hell-bent on rescuing his comrade.
He was the partner from the old days, and I have to rescue him.
Hitler's plan would elevate the reputation of an obscure fellow Austrian Nazi with little training, but much ambition. SS Captain Otto Skorzeny.
When it became clear we must rescue Mussolini, then the German paratroop was offered, yeah, we can do this. But then Himmler decided, and also Hitler, and no, Skorzeny has to take part, just as an observer in this operation.
Italy was changing sides, but Nazi Germany still had ears and eyes across the country. Agents tracked Mussolini to the Apennine Mountains of central Italy.
The Germans had a very good intelligence service, and they also intercepted wireless telegrams. They had spies on the ground, so it became quite clear where Mussolini was on every day. And so after a couple of days, they knew, oh, he's in the Gran Sasso Hotel.
Standing over the Gran Sasso Plateau, the skiing hotel Campo Imperatore commanded strategic views. Mussolini's jailers could see any potential attackers coming. Extracting him would be a challenge, even for modern commandos. Helicopters were not available to German paratroopers in World War II. Ulrich Wegener founded a West German anti-terrorist unit in 1973. The Special Forces veteran has looked back beyond his service to assess the operation to rescue Mussolini.
From a tactical point of view, the location wasn't a bad choice. It was almost impossible to approach the hotel, the Duce's prison, without being noticed.
The new Italian administration may have felt that its prisoner and future was secure. Conventional German troops were battling an Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. British and American forces moved forward from landings at Calabria and Salerno. With their former fascist allies in disarray, much of the fighting was left to the German occupiers. Another critical blow landed in September 1943, when the Allied commander, General Eisenhower, dropped a bombshell. The Italian administration had capitulated and agreed to hand Mussolini over to the Allies. But much of Italy was in chaos. Rome was not secured.
The crucial point was that the Italian leadership, the military and political leadership, left. And nobody knew what to do. So they didn't announce, you have to fight against the Germans, the Allies are now our partners, nothing of that. So there was chaos. And the Germans were always very good if there was a surprise situation. And they reacted very quickly.
German forces seized control in Rome. The Italian king fled with his new prime minister to the safety of the Allied-occupied port of Brindisi. The people were left to fend for themselves. With his troops in control of the capital, Hitler could concentrate on rescuing his old comrade, the fallen dictator Benito Mussolini, from his mountaintop prison. Elite Fallschirmjäger, or parachute troops, would be flown in to snatch Il Duce from the traitors holding him in the central Italian peaks. On the 12th of September 1943, 12 gliders were towed into the air from an airfield south of Rome. One of them held a special observer on board, a relatively obscure SS captain, Otto Skorzeny. The rescue mission would catapult the Viennese SS man into the limelight. Skorzeny would ensure that he was center stage when the propaganda cameras rolled. The paratroopers on board braced for landing, and a pitched battle with Italian traitors who were supposedly about to hand over their former dictator to face Allied justice. The apparently gallant, brave, and most importantly successful rescue was recorded for triumphant Nazi newsreels.
Der Duce ist frei. Männer des SD und der Waffen-SS sowie Fallschirmjäger haben den Auftrag des Führers erfüllt. Links neben dem Duce SS-Hauptsturmführer Skorseny, der in kühnem, raschen Zupacken den Duce aus seinem Gefängnis herausholte.
In the German newsreel, everybody thought, oh, it was all done by Skorseny. So you could say, well, the whole operation was run by Luftwaffe paratroopers, and he was just an observer. But there is a but. So Skorseny was the first guy who spoke to Mussolini. So, yes, he turned from an observer into somehow a key role because he was the first at the entrance of the hotel.
The apparently fearless raid was not what it seemed. Otto Skorzeny stole the limelight, and the paratroopers took the Duce, without a shot being fired, yet photographs clearly show that his Italian captors were armed.
Well, nowadays we know that there was the decision taken, we're not going to fire a shot, we don't want to have any German reprisals. If we're going to kill Mussolini, I mean, the reprisals might be really very bad, so let's have the Germans have Mussolini, and then they will be happy with that.
Heavy machine guns on the hotel roof had been dismantled. Rather than resist, the Italian guards posed with the Germans for photographs. Their commander, Giuseppe Guelli, was clearly unprepared for combat, dressed in a civilian suit.
Guelli received a telegram from Rome telling him to exercise extreme care in relation to Mussolini. He told the officer in charge that this code word had been agreed in advance. It was an order from the Ministry of the Interior to leave Mussolini to the Germans and definitely not to fire a shot.
The show wasn't over. Mussolini was to be flown to Rome in a small reconnaissance plane. His rescuers were supposed to stay behind, but one of them squeezed his considerable bulk next to the fallen dictator.
Normally he was not allowed to sit in this small little airplane. The airplane was overloaded. When Skorseny was quite a big man, so 100 kilos, and it nearly crashed the aircraft, and then the pilot was able to fly then to Rome. So it was a really dangerous situation. But Skorseny recognized, this is my chance. This is my chance. The cameras are on Mussolini, and I have to use and take advantage of this situation, which he absolutely did.
The previously obscure SS captain had taken off as a mere observer and returned as a hero. From Rome, Mussolini was eventually delivered to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The mission was proclaimed as one of the most daring and successful commando raids of the war. In reality, Mussolini's captors had not bothered to fire a single round. The Italian leadership was perhaps glad to be rid of a potential liability.
In 1922, the king had transferred power to Mussolini and had signed all the laws the new dictator gave him, including the race laws of 1938 and the declaration of war. Marshal Badoglio had made his career in a fascist regime, and above all, he had used poison gas during the colonial war in Egypt in 1935. He could have been convicted as a war criminal. They could both have been prosecuted for this, something like a small Italian Nuremberg trial. And Mussolini was bound to give statements about the king's and Badoglio's shared historical and political responsibility.
Desperate to deflect attention from defeat in the East, Nazi propaganda elevated the brazen Otto Skorzeny to a kind of national hero. There was no such glory for Benito Mussolini. He was installed as a puppet ruler of what remained of Nazi-occupied Italy.
Mussolini then met Hitler, and he persuaded Mussolini to become head of the new fascist state in northern Italy with the headquarters in Salò at Lake Garda. In the end, he had almost no influence.
His humiliation ended in capture and execution by partisans in 1945. His corpse was strung up, together with that of his mistress, outside a petrol station in Milan. Otto Skorzeny's remarkable fortune continued. Even when he admitted fighting in an American uniform, he was spared by his Allied captors. He wrote about his wartime exploits and became a wealthy retiree in sunny Spain, an unrepentant Nazi to the end.
Ich kann Ihnen sagen, dass ich dasselbe genauso heute noch einmal tun würde.
Many senior SS men like Otto Skorzeny survived the war and prospered. But in Nazi-occupied territories like the former Czechoslovakia, thousands were tortured or murdered by German occupiers. In 1941, SS security chief Reinhard Heydrich ruled the so-called Protectorate with an iron fist.
History has to describe Reinhard Heydrich as a monster.
Reinhard Heydrich was a key figure of the SS. So he was head of the secret police, of the political police. He was the organizer of the Holocaust. He chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942.
Where they mapped out in a morning how to dispense with the Jewish people of Europe.
Hundreds of miles away, in London, a plot was hatched to eliminate the ruthless Heydrich.
He was a key figure, a key symbol of the Nazi regime. And he said, well, we have to kill him.
The idea to kill Heydrich was devised in London in 1941, and the idea was stemmed very much from the thinking of the Czech government in exile. So that's President Beneš and particularly his intelligence chief, Moravec.
If you have in mind what was going on in Prague, for example, in spring '42, so it was rather a peaceful time, and the whole Czech economy was working for the Nazis, and especially in the armament industry. We must do something. It can't go on like this if the Czech people in the end have a peaceful collaboration with Nazis. So we must do something.
And there was a feeling in London that the Czech government in exile was losing value and was losing credit in the eyes of the Allies.
To re-establish their anti-Nazi credentials, the administration in exile turned to the British government, in particular the SOE, or Special Operations Executive.
So SOE was set up in 1940. Its job was to encourage resistance and carry out sabotage in enemy territory. And when it was set up, Churchill instructed that SOE should set Europe ablaze.
In this case, one of Hitler's most notorious henchmen would be set ablaze by Czech agents trained in Britain. After intensive SOE training, 2 men were selected to lead the assassination: Sergeant Jan Kubis and Josef Gabčík. Their target, Reinhard Heydrich, the dreaded governor of Prague. A long-range bomber took them back towards their homeland, deep into what had become enemy territory. But after much time, effort, and expense, the Czech assassins were supplied with a relatively cheap and sometimes unreliable weapon, the Sten gun. Former counter-terrorist chief Ulrich Ricky Wegner knows a thing or two about the importance of reliable weapons in a crisis. He led the successful storming of a hijacked Lufthansa plane in Somalia in 1977. 3 of 4 terrorists died. All passengers and crew were saved. The security advisor is scathing in his view of the weapons supplied to the Czechs.
It's the most primitive weapon I know. I can say that openly. Some of the time it was homemade in workshops, and it performed accordingly. That means if it wasn't loaded precisely, it tended to jam.
The Czech agents made it into Prague with their primitive weapons, unnoticed. By May 1942, they had been in the capital for 6 weeks, observing and learning the route that Heydrich took through city streets. The SS security chief insisted on traveling in an open-top car without armor or escorts. Hitler would later fume that Heydrich was stupid and idiotic to do so. The assassins were waiting at a sharp bend where the driver had to slow down. Reinhard Heydrich was supposed to die in a hail of machine gun fire.
The Sten gun did seem to be problematic because normally it would when it did jam, it jammed because it overheated, but through continuous use. However, it jammed at the very moment where they attempted to fire.
The Sten gun was absolutely unsuitable for use by special forces under these conditions.
They had a backup weapon. When the Sten gun jammed, the other agent, Jan Kubis, hurled a bomb of plastic explosives.
They tried to shoot him in that field. They threw a grenade at him, and although he was wounded, he wasn't exceptionally badly wounded to the point of being killed. He had a shrapnel wound.
Shrapnel passed through the car seat and into Heydrich's body, taking minute fragments of upholstery with it. Despite his wounds, Hitler's henchmen tried to shoot at his attackers, but the Czech agents escaped on bicycles. Heydrich was taken to the Bulovka hospital. Top Nazi doctors, including Hitler's personal physician Theodor Morell, were sent to Prague. Surgeons removed his spleen.
In 99% of the population, removing the spleen is easily tolerated and doesn't lead to any complications, at least not acute ones.
At first, the emergency surgery seemed to have worked. The Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia was sitting up in bed, enjoying breakfast, when he suddenly collapsed into a coma from which he would never re-emerge. He was the ruthless SS security chief, yet insisted on traveling in an unarmored, open-topped Mercedes. His arrogance proved fatal. A tiny fragment, possibly some of the plush upholstery from the leather limousine interior, felled one of the most feared fanatics in the Third Reich.
What we now believe is that the shrapnel took some horsehair from the actual car that penetrated the wound, and although they took the shrapnel out, that small piece of horsehair effectively developed into septicemia, blood poisoning, and that is what killed him. So it was ironic. The mission was accomplished, albeit longer than we thought.
Records from Heydrich's post-mortem show that doctors knew about the contamination of his wound and the dangers of infection. But was the Reichsprotector's poisoning an accident? The secret British Chemical Weapons Centre at Porton Down, near Salisbury, began experimenting with biological weapons in 1940. One of its officers suggested it may have played a part, that it supplied SOE agents with toxic botulinum grenades, the bacterium we call Botox.
But I think it's unlikely that they used toxins in the case of the Heydrich assassination. The evidence just doesn't add up.
Botulinum must be stored carefully. The agents who stayed in Prague for many weeks before the attack would have been unable to do so. The bomb used to kill Heydrich was a basic device, and the way he died was not consistent with botulinum poisoning.
The poisoning with Botox, as it is known today, would normally have led to a speedy respiratory paralysis within hours, maybe 2 days. But the fact that he got better and then worse again completely contradicts this theory.
Hitler's loyal disciple, an architect of the Holocaust, was honored with a state funeral in Berlin. A frenzy of revenge killing was unleashed on the Czechs. Flawed intelligence linked the village of Lidice to the assassins. It was destroyed, regardless. 1,500 people were executed. Thousands more were sent to the death camps.
These people would not have been killed if Heydrich would not have been assassinated. And in the end, it doesn't change anything. I mean, there was still a collaboration. The armament industry in Pilsen, for example, Skoda and so on, still worked for the Third Reich.
3 weeks after Heydrich's assassination, the killers were still at large. Prague was locked down under a strict curfew. The Nazis offered 1 million Reichsmarks reward to anyone who would betray them. It worked. the agents were trapped in a church and paid the ultimate price. According to SOE files, they knew their mission was a likely death sentence. Statements read, "The agents know that there is nowhere to run, and they are prepared to share Heydrich's death."
Personally, I think it's remarkable they got that far, that they even got to that stage. To have survived in occupied Czechoslovakia for 5 months without being caught, and then to actually get as close to Heydrich as they did.
Such life-or-death missions were a leap into the unknown. Unlike conventional soldiers, British Special Operations executive agents could not expect any mercy if captured. Ordered to set Europe ablaze, many brave SOE agents perished in the conflagration. The life expectancy of a wireless operator in occupied France was just 6 weeks. But British saboteurs recorded several stunning successes in the war, and an audacious kidnap operation in German-occupied Crete was one of them. For the Germans, Crete was a vital strategic asset. It was a stepping stone to Africa and a potential air and naval base to protect oil fields to the north. A huge garrison of some 30,000 troops was stationed there. But their time under the Mediterranean sun was spoiled by British agents, like Patrick "Paddy" Lee Firmer. He spent 1.5 years on Crete, disguised as a shepherd, harassing the enemy, before he was sent back. Fluent in Greek and German, he had the knowledge and skills to pull off a stunning coup.
Now, this plan was eventually devised to kidnap General Muller, a particularly brutal and unpleasant commander on Crete. He left the island and was replaced by General Kreiper.
Generalmajor Kreiper was a respected veteran of both the First and Second World Wars and had served with distinction in Russia.
Kreiper was less unpleasant, and yet the propaganda value, the publicity value of a successful kidnapping was considerable. This was at a time when the British and the Allies were planning the invasion of Europe. These sort of operations, these eye-catching operations in the Mediterranean, all helped with the deception value, the idea of of attracting German forces and attracting German attention away from Western Europe and tying down German forces in the Mediterranean and the Balkans and that sort of thing.
After the horrors of the Eastern Front, Generalmajor Karl-Heinrich Kreiper settled into the comforts of a sun-splashed villa near the ancient ruins of Knossos. The garrison commander went home for dinner every night at 8, unaware that his routine was being watched by British agents and their local contacts. Dressed as German military police, Patrick "Paddy" Lee Firmer and his fellow agents stopped the Generalmajor's car.
Halt!
The decorated Wehrmacht commander, who had led and survived heavy fighting in France and Russia, was captured with ease. His unfortunate driver was also seized and later killed. General Kreiper was bundled under the back seat. Impersonating him and his driver, the British agents in the front bluffed their way through a staggering 22 checkpoints.
In terms of the security there, it's interesting that the general who was captured, he himself insisted that all checkpoints be well manned and that everyone be checked, everyone except him. He resented people questioning his authority or insisting that they check his paperwork.
Once out in the wilderness, the British agents dumped the car and left a vital message in a bid to protect the local population that helped them. The kidnappers left a calling card. Your general has been kidnapped by a British commando. Retributions against the Greek population are not warranted. It ended with a veiled warning. See you again soon.
They were aware of the Germans' kind of retaliation on missions. They would, execute villagers, and they wanted to make the point that this was not a partisan activity, but activity by the Special Operations Executive.
It didn't work. One mountain village suspected of collaborating with the British was emptied of its inhabitants and obliterated. A massive island-wide manhunt failed to find the commander or the SOE agents holding him. The British agents marched their captive across isolated and rugged terrain over the 2.5-kilometer high Mount Ida. It was a marathon journey. Despite the threat of reprisals, local villagers fed the British agents and sheltered them from the German manhunt. Thousands of troops scoured the country below, while spotter planes searched from the skies above.
The SOE officers and agents could do very little without the assistance of the local population. They had to have people to hide them and to feed them, to guide them, to assist them in getting stores together, to assist them in laying ambushes and laying attacks. So the role of the Cretan population was key.
The character of the two British agents, Patrick Paddy Lee Fermer and Stanley Moss, was also key. Their captive was almost 50 years old. Despite the heavy going, they managed to cajole the senior German general to carry on with them. After being on the run for 3 weeks, they finally reached the south coast and a rendezvous with a boat bound for Cairo. The Egyptian capital was the headquarters of British operations in the Middle East. Once in custody there, the war was over for General-Major Karl-Heinrich Kreiper.
There was great publicity. You see the story of Kreiper appear on the front page of British newspapers. He's reported all around. British certainly make the most of it. And Moss and Lee Fermer are both awarded gallantry medals.
After interrogation in Cairo, General-Major Kreiper was transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Britain. He was eventually released in 1947.
Patrick Lee Fermer.
Long after the war was over, an unlikely bond seemed to have endured between a kidnapper and his victim.
And, of course, we know you speak Greek fluently, maybe better than us.
Patrick Lee Fermer was famously reunited with Karl-Heinrich Kreiper on Greek television in 1972. It was an apparently warm reunion for the two former foes. Both congratulated the other on how well they had aged since their ordeal over the mountaintops of Crete. Of course, few wartime experiences had a happy ending, especially those involving espionage and murder. Towards the end of 1944, Allied forces had advanced to western German cities like Aachen. Nazi defenders were beaten back after pitched battles on the frontiers of Hitler's Reich. Aachen was the first German city to fall to the Allies. But as defeat loomed, a desperate Nazi regime exerted an ever tighter grip on the population.
The Nazi movement, the Nazi party, was able to get much more control of the state and the people. And it was terror. And everybody who said, well, no, the war's over, got really in serious trouble. So they sometimes even believed, yes, the war's over, we might be killed, but we will take the German people with us.
The medieval city was in ruins. Only a fraction of its shell-shocked population remained.
This was Aachen the day after its fall. The job of rehabilitation would not be easy. The chief rail station would have to be repaired. The military government section went to work, establishing order, restoring communications.
As well as roads and railways, the occupiers needed to repair the civil administration to restore some kind of order amid the devastation of war.
The city limits. German civilians were pressed into service for this and other tasks.
The Americans decided to appoint a mayor. A Catholic lawyer, Franz Oppenhoff, who was seen as relatively untainted by the Nazi regime. For Allied administrators, Germans like Oppenhoff were vital to establish order in captured cities, while the war continued elsewhere. His appointment was announced in the press. But to fanatical Nazis like SS chief Heinrich Himmler, such collaborators were traitors who deserved to be eliminated. The German people were compelled to join a last desperate do-or-die battle against the Allies.
They tried to move that idea of an ideological war, a war to the last child, the last man, and these things to the West. The problem was the German people were not very convinced. They perceived the West, it's bad that we lost the war, but it's not the worst thing if you are captured by the Americans or the British.
Die-hard Nazis aimed to crush such defeatist attitudes with terror. They dreamed of a resistance movement dubbed Werewolf. The fairy tale castle of Hülkraat near Düsseldorf became a lair for werewolves, a group of would-be assassins ordered to slaughter the American-appointed mayor of Aachen. The so-called werewolf commando would spread fear and terror, sending a stark message to traitors who dared to collaborate with the Allies. Heinrich Himmler had the first victim in his sights, the hapless mayor, Franz Oppenhoff.
If you are going to collaborate on that scale, we are going to kill you. So we are in a very big struggle. We have not lost the war already. We will win. There will be a final victory. And if you're going to collaborate, we are going to kill you.
A commando unit, including members of the Hitler Youth, an SS officer, and a woman, Ilse Hirsch, plotted the murder of Franz Oppenhoff. But the American-appointed mayor was in occupied territory. The werewolves would have to find a way past the Allied lines.
There was this problem, how do you get to the occupied territory? So you must cross the front line. And there was a special bomber wing, the KG-200, and they did special operations behind enemy lines, and they had a captured flying fortress, a captured B-17. And they used this captured B-17 to parachute these people, this command operation, behind the enemy lines, so in the near of Aachen.
The assassins were flown over the border into Belgium. They parachuted into a forest, killed a Belgian border guard, crossed back into Germany, and set up a base camp. From there, it was the key woman in the group, Ilse Hirsch, who led the killers to Franz Oppenhoff's home. Oppenhoff was summoned from a party at a neighbor's house. The assassins pretended to be downed German pilots looking for the front lines. When Oppenhoff urged them to surrender to the Americans, SS radio operator Sepp Leitgeb is said to have screamed "Heil Hitler" before shooting the father of three in the head at point-blank range. werewolf commandos slipped away in the night. It was the first and only headline success of a so-called resistance movement that ultimately failed.
This was a good example of explaining, yes, there is a will of resistance from the German people. So, look, the German werewolf organization have killed the mayor of Aachen, so there is a danger to everybody who's going to collaborate with the Allies. So he used this for his propaganda campaign. And in the end, the outcome was nothing, and nobody was interested in that.
The man who pulled the trigger, SS radio operator Sepp Leitgeb, was later said to have died, caught in a blast after fellow saboteur Ilse Hirsch stepped on a mine. Hirsch and 3 of her co-conspirators survived. They were eventually arrested, tried, and sentenced. But none of them would spend long terms behind bars.
The perpetrators were not punished for the murder, but for manslaughter or aiding manslaughter. They received prison sentences of up to 4 years in their first trial. In 1952, the sentences were reduced to a maximum of 1.5 years.
The brutal murder of Franz Oppenhoff was little more than a brief propaganda coup. Like the other clandestine commando-style operations featured in this program, it was all about sending a stark message. Modern war differently, sometimes by remote control or by a small strike team slipped in a hostile territory. The rules have also changed. IEDs and suicide bombers are employed in places like Afghanistan, where the enemy lurks among the local population.
Where is the battlefront these days? It's very hard to be able to see, in many cases, a battlefield on which to fight. A lot of the legislation that was drawn up, a lot of the conventions and laws that were drawn up to govern the fighting of warfare are 67 apply to the. It's hard to tell when you have, for example, the commander of Al Qaeda living in Pakistan, arguably a legitimate target. The head of a global network, but not the head of a nation state. Are you allowed to target him? Can you kill him? The world is changing, and so is modern warfare.
A new kind of secret war emerging. A war without front lines, where eliminating the enemy may involve operating far from home, where legal and political boundaries are blurred. But like the commando raids of old, modern so-called special forces operations have a common aim: to show an enemy that there's nowhere to hide.